Or listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Points of View. Have you subscribed to our weekly newsletter yet? It's called Sound Bites and Insights, and it's delivered to 10,000 educators a week. It contains a curated selection of 4 standout TTR shows from the week, exclusive discounts and exclusive offers from our sponsors. Sign up on our website at ttradio.org/newsletter. This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles and use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. The Chalk and Talk podcast. If you're looking for another great education podcast, check out the Chalk and Talk podcast with Anna Stoke. Anna is a passionate advocate for evidence-based math education for students of all ages. On her podcast, she talks about everything from effective teaching methods and how to guide for teaching and maths facts for tips for evaluating research shows claims. She brings on top-notch guests, educators, researchers, and policymakers, and discusses issues that directly impact teachers and students. Chalk and Talk is for anyone interested in education. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. So good morning, guys. I think, Carl, did you want to take us into the first story?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah, happy to kick us off. I think, Yasmin, this is becoming something of a tradition in education, this particular topic. It's usually mentioned twice a year, about this time and also about the time that GCSE results come out. So in the middle, late part of August. So it's about GCSEs themselves. And there has been another call from some parties for GCSEs to be scrapped. So to summarise, GCSEs have been around since 1986, and they were created originally to replace a 2-tier system. There were O levels and there were CSEs, for those people old enough to remember those. And so they've been around a long time, and they had a major overhaul around about 2014, when a series of reforms under the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, introduced a much more, if you like, content-driven model. So most of the GCSEs were packed with more content, and most of the GCSE assessments were reformed so that there was far fewer coursework elements and far more straight exam with an emphasis on memory. So, a number of practices that had been previously used in GCSEs were no longer used. So, you couldn't take your textbook into an English literature exam or things like that. So we've reached the end of the exam season, and that's comprised of typically a GCSE student in year 11 sits about 31 hours of exams over a period that mostly extends over 5 weeks. And this is taken usually at 16, and some people are saying that the system is outdated and that it needs to be replaced with something that is more befitting of the 21st century. But then there are other people who say, well, actually, it does serve a useful purpose, and that there are, good reasons why GCSEs were reformed, and that while there may be a need for reform, there isn't necessarily a strong case for replacement. So trying to sum up all the different elements quickly, That's the nature of the debate. So who wants to start?
I don't mind going ahead. I feel like I've got mixed views, to be honest. I'd say I am definitely in support of GCSEs. If anything, like I actually really liked when the last government introduced, things like P8 and even in many ways the numbering system for GCSEs. I think that we need, a robust exam system so that children can, essentially showcase their talents, go on to great levels of education, compete with people internationally. Like I really support that. I would say at the same time, I think with the, just constantly changing needs of children or circumstances of children, I think there are definitely also some children who fall through the gaps. I think it was something like a third of children in England don't pass GCSE English and maths. And, that to me is really sad. I don't think the solution is to get rid of GCSEs for everybody. But I definitely think that there should be, more options for children that are also considered important, or also give them an opportunity to follow, a career path or experience success at school in a way that benefits them. Like, there's like that argument at school when children are new to the country, should they be entered for GCSE history, for example? And, I've worked with teachers who'd be like, no, this is a waste of time. It's not good to enter them for this, just, in the name of achieving EBAC. And then there are other teachers who'll be like, no, they should give them the opportunity. Like it shouldn't just be language that's a barrier. At least they've had the chance. So, do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like there's huge variations across schools, but overall, I'm definitely in support of GCSEs. I think they're a very good thing. I think they should even be harder. But at the same time, like I feel like a robust exam system is really important for any society of children. But at the same time, I couldn't possibly ignore how many children just don't pass the, fundamental GCSEs and the impact it continues to have on their life. And I don't want that either.
No, the so-called forgotten third, they're sometimes referred to. And I think there's Yasmin in that, and what you say, an element of, to a degree, it's what you might call the banana-rama approach to this, which is it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. Insofar as it's not so much whether GCSEs should be scrapped or not, but how GCSEs are assessed, how they are taught, what the content is. The main background for the debate probably is, because there are views on either sides. And I hasten to add, both from the right and the left, you can find major figures on both the scrap side and the keep side. But I think the real debate is probably more centered around how they can be reformed and improved rather than, replaced outright. What do you think, Tarjinder?
I mean, I've been hearing this debate for a long time, and I think ultimately it kind of comes down to a similar debate along similar lines, which is that it doesn't suit all children. And no, I don't think all children should all be sitting GCSEs. But the problem that we keep having, and like you said, it is perennial, is there are children for whom they probably are not suitable because they're not the most academic, or that's not the route they want to go down. But we never seem to be in a position where we actually improve the vocational side. We just seem to mess around with the academic side. And I get so tired of this, because it's like, well, we're still not dealing with the issue. So what has happened in the past, and understandably, and I think there was some justification for saying that there was a dumbing down, there was grade inflation, this was not helping anybody. So some people quite happily would go down that route because they feel like all should win prizes kind of thing. But that's not the way to make everybody succeed to the best of their abilities, or to help them achieve what they can achieve in the situation. So again, I sort of say, well, okay, fine, we can meddle around with these GCSEs, you can replace them, you can do whatever, but what are we actually going to do to make the vocational system better? We still don't seem to have a clue about this, and yet we keep meddling around with the bits that we think we can meddle around with and don't make the situation better for anybody. So the children who are more academic don't get don't have their achievements, but the children who are not so academic but are gifted in their own way, or have their own skills and talents, don't get acknowledged either. So where do we go from here? Because I just think the same people seem to be making the same arguments, and yet we're not actually dealing with the problem. When it comes to maths and English, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because under the old system of O levels and CS levels, actually some of those children would have achieved maths and English. They would have got something reasonable. But because we've said, no, there's just one tier now, we were not going to have two tiers, we're just going to have one tier. We kind of place ourselves in a weird situation. And I know that people don't necessarily like it, but nobody ever said that the old CS levels were so poor and were so lower down compared to, say, O levels or GCSEs, they could not be accepted. So this is my question, is should we have two separate levels so that we can, but that level has still got to have a standard that we teach to, because it can't just be basically you can't even string a sentence but you get this qualification. Do you know what I mean? It can't be that. It's got to be something. It's got to be functional skills versus what do you need for to be on your pathway to, say, potentially something academic or something that requires you to have a higher level of academic knowledge.
Can I say, I agree with that, by the way, Tarjinder. Can I just say, just anecdotally, one thing that I've noticed about GCSEs, I'm grateful to have done GCSEs. I went to a state school in West London that placed a huge emphasis on academia, in particular the EBAC and achieving the EBAC. And so, it was really hard to not end up valuing every subject in the same way. So for example, now as a teacher, I've noticed I can have children getting 8s and 9s in science, but on a 3 or a 4 in MFL because they just don't value learning an additional language. And whereas when I was at school, that wasn't the case at all. But one thing that I just have found concerning about GCSEs over the years is yes, whilst it's been great for the top end and the children who go on to these incredible sixth forms and degrees, I'm noticing more and more that even the children who would have made it to sixth forms to do A levels a decade ago often aren't now. And I've got a lot of younger cousins who I accompany to results days, and just seeing every couple of years the prerequisites for A levels are just getting higher and higher, and less children are attaining it and are only able to get BTECs. Last summer I took some relatives to 2 different cousins to 2 different GCSE results days, and one in particular wanted to do A levels, and she had a mix of decent grades, but the school essentially pushed for her to do BTEC. And I just remember sitting there thinking, had this been a decade ago, you would have comfortably qualified for A levels. And I just keep thinking about how already we kind of have this system where there are already children who, because of this rise in prerequisites at each successive stage of education, just aren't able to progress to the qualifications they aspire to achieve. And Percy, I just find that really sad. I know there are loads of children it works for and do go on to do really well, but there's just this bit in the middle, and then also the children who aren't even passing English and maths at all that I do really worry about. And I completely agree with Tarjinder that there needs to be more vocational options. There just aren't. It's just never. It never really gets anywhere. And I think what I am concerned about is if we do have a 2-tier system, is I just feel like they're not going to be given the same kind of credibility or importance. I've grown up in a time where the word BTEC is used as a slur. It's used as an insult for something that isn't good enough. And BTEC qualifications now, you can, if you do a level 3 BTEC, you can get into most universities and do whatever degree or most degrees that you want to do. So do you know what I mean? A child who's done a level 3 BTEC has done very well, but it's still actually a slur. So I just worry if we have, even though I agree with what Tarjinder's saying, I'm just, in addition to that, concerned, would the same credibility be given to different kind of pathways? And I'm not really sure they would be.
Can I just bring in Carl? Carl has called in with a comment. The level of life competence most people need in English and maths and other does not require a GCSE in its current form. Now that I think reflects one of the body of GCSE critics. I think the Tony Blair Institute has been very vocal on this in the past, that the nature of the assessment, whether it's GCSE or otherwise, they argue is not really in quote fit for the 21st century, or the competencies that employers and society need people to demonstrate in the 21st century. Tarjinder, did you have a view on that?
Well, you know what my views on 21st century anything, because you already have the 20th century stuff, and it was the same nonsense, quite frankly. Ultimately, you've got to be able to judge competence in any kind of examination situation. Coursework was basically pretty much a disaster from what I can make out and from all involved that were, and I'm not a secondary teacher, I'm a primary teacher, but from all my secondary colleagues, pretty much it was like, no, didn't work. It really did bias the system way too much towards the middle class. And actually what happened was you end up with this pressure of allowing retake after retake after retake, and not just like in a certain situation, but like actually, you just allowed them to carry on doing it. So it wasn't fair, right? It didn't make the situation better. And I think certainly now with AI, ChatGPT, all the rest of it, you're just going to end up with that plus worse. So I don't think that the traditional exam is necessarily a bad thing, but I do think it needs to be considered where it is delivered and for which subjects. And in terms of like the level of knowledge that you need in maths and English, well, I think from a cultural sort of perspective, you would want Key Stage 3 to sort of remain the same. It's a question of what happens when we go into exams. That's what really it's about. Do you know what I mean? So you should have a fair go at all these subjects up to a certain point. And yeah, there will be people who will say even then you shouldn't, but I think you should. I think you should have that entitlement. But the question is, when it comes to exams, what do you actually do? And I'm agreeing with Yasmin on this one, like how do you make it fairer? How do you make it so that everybody thinks the same thing? So it all values these different qualifications in the same way. I think the problem that you've got is just a whole load of middle-class snobbery in this country. And I don't think you're going to end up in a German situation easily, because over there, actually, for a long time, even if you're middle class and your kid's like, wants to do a technical qualification, it's fine. Like no one looks down on their nose at you if that's the case. But what happens in this country is people do, and with due respect, even the stupidest middle-class child will end up in university before a clever one will from a working-class background, because that's the way things are. And I think unless you can have a cultural shift whereby actually you don't care about these things, you care about the importance to your child. And yes, people will talk the talk on this, they won't actually walk the walk on this, because what they'll actually do is just go and get a tutor and help their child get as many, privileges as they can before they end up at the next stage. I don't know what you can do about that. I genuinely don't. I think, like I said, we need a proper shift, and I think we need to value these qualifications more. And I think we need to see the equivalent as well, because part of the problem is those people who come from a more academic background don't actually have much knowledge about things like BTECs and what that actually involves. And so that in itself becomes an issue, because of course, if it's something that you have no idea about, like I know about GCSEs, how much do I know about BTECs or other qualifications? I don't. So it's easy to make the assumption that somehow it's lesser rather than an equivalent, but in a different way.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with those points at all, to be fair. I mean, just to throw in a bit of evidence here that at least I've come across, which is that apparently across England as a whole, 30% of parents at some point employ tutors to help their children. In London, it's 47%. So
I can believe that.
Quite a bit higher still. Sorry, yeah, you were saying, Yasmin, you could believe that.
Yeah. I think there is very much a tuition culture in London. I think a lot of it is, I think there are like two sides to it. Yes, I know there are a lot of, well-off families who want to help their children get the best possible qualifications. But I also know of many poor families who try to compensate for maybe, having moved to England, not having gone through the education system, not understanding it, wanting to help their children do as well as possible, and through word of mouth, hear from a lot of their neighbors about tuition and often take their children there. It's in many ways an industry that just makes me a bit uncomfortable. I think there are so many parents that have been exploited in that industry, and it makes me really sad. Like, when I was a kid, my mum always used to ask me, like, my mum didn't have any qualifications in the UK. She grew up in Somalia and then later Italy and Switzerland. But she always used to ask me, is that like something that would be beneficial to you? And I remember actually it was my biggest motivator for always doing my homework and my revision myself, was because I felt like I knew that my mum couldn't afford it. And so I didn't want her to feel like she needed to get me a tutor. So I always tried to stay on top of things at school myself. And, but, I remember many other families who felt like they had to do that for their children. So it doesn't surprise me to hear that at all. I live and work in one of the boroughs with, I think it's got the second highest rates of child deprivation in London. So I'm in Newham, and it's so normal for a kid to be like, I can't come to detention, I've got tuition after school, or, I spend my weekends in English, maths and science tuition. That's like a completely normal kind of phrase. So that doesn't surprise me at all in London. And it does make me feel really bad for a lot of parents, because I know they just want the best for their kids. And there are so many. I remember when tuition used to often be for children that were aiming for the top end, like children who, no question, were going to pass GCSEs, but were aiming for, higher grades. And now there are kids who, whose parents are paying so much money to just get them to pass English and maths at GCSE. And that does make me, really sad. And I feel like it does say a lot about the current system that we have. But just to go back to Tarjinder's point about coursework and modular exams, when I was at school, I left school in 2012. And I remember when I was at school, we used to have, they changed it towards the end of school, but we had modular exams, but we all got given this thing. I think it was called like the Fisher Family Trust. Like there was this thing called a TMG.
Right.
Yeah,
the government charity. Yeah.
There was this thing called TMGs, which were like target minimum grades, which was basically the minimum grade you should be getting for each subject at GCSE, based on a combination of things, like prior attainment. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. But and I remember, like, even though I had top grades in year 6, in year 9, when I got to year 10 and 11 and I was given my TMGs, they were all a B across the board. And I remember I used to ask my teachers, and also when I got to A level as well, despite having like an A star in certain subjects at GCSE, I'd be predicted a B at A level. And I remember, like, I would ask my teachers, why is that? How come it's never an A or an A star? And they'd say, oh, because it takes household income and like parents' qualifications into account. And so what I remember when we had these modular exams is, if you got a grade that was either on, if it will say on your target minimum grade, you wouldn't be allowed to resit. But often what would happen is the children from the wealthiest backgrounds often had the highest target minimum grades, and so they could sit an exam up to 4 times. If your target minimum grade was an A star and you were getting an A, you could do that up to 4 times and eventually would get the A star anyway, because you've done it so many times. And like, I often look back and think that contributed more to the disparities in education, I feel. So
Sorry, Yasmin.
Okay.
There are a couple of things I think your school were being a little bit economical with the truth about. It will surprise nobody. The first is, and an FFT is alive and well and still has a significant part to play in the landscape on these things.
Yeah.
But first of all, those grades that FFT generated, at the time when they generated them, they made it quite clear that schools shouldn't share them with young people. They were a benchmark for schools to measure themselves against for progress, particularly in the days before Progress 8. And that was because the idea was not to demotivate or motivate a student with that particular target, but simply to say, typically, people from this background and this academic, profile in terms of prior attainment, typically, statistically, that is where the grade ends up being. But they made it quite clear that schools shouldn't do what, with due respect to your school, they obviously did do. That I think is partly that it may be that the teachers themselves didn't fully appreciate that the importance of that difference in the the logic by which those grades were generated. So I think that was a misuse of data, quite honestly. And I'm sorry that you were on the receiving end of it. Could I just throw in that the Becky Francis review, the curriculum review, which currently has given an interim report, but is planned for its full report in the autumn, has outlined 4 suggestions, to use its overall phrase, for evolution, not revolution. And I would imagine that something along these lines will actually come to pass over the next few months. So number 1 is reducing the number of exams. I think there is quite a lot of shall we say, there's a lot of support for the idea that 31 hours is unnecessarily drawn out and probably doesn't achieve anything for anybody that sort of 25 hours wouldn't achieve, Stripping back the content is probably the one that's of most significance to most teachers. There are many GCSE subjects where the content hugely increased from 2015 onwards. As a history teacher, that's particularly very evident. I mean, you'd hardly come across a history teacher that didn't say the content is way, way too much now. So I think there's a movement to strip back the content, a realization that just teaching vast amounts of content doesn't necessarily lead to better teaching or better learning. Broadening vocational options, which I think both of you have alluded to as being important. And I think there is a widespread acceptance that it would be good to increase the number of vocational options, because they have actually significantly narrowed over the last 10 years since those curriculum reforms. And Tarjinder, both in Yasmin, you've talked about the need for different pathways, and that's not to say that people don't continue to take GCSEs as part of those pathways, but for some young people, those pathways are more appropriate. And also they are looking more, I think, at the implications for digital forms of assessment. But I'm really glad that Tarjinder was mentioning AI, because ironically, I think we might be in this country in quite an advantageous position, in that it's increasingly clear that you can't assess using digital technology in its normal form now because of AI. Because if you did, you would get it wouldn't be the child's work, the young person's work, it would be somebody else's work. And it's very hard to get around that. So in fact, giving people a pen and a piece of paper is probably the most reliable way of avoiding that situation. Carl's come back in, a different Carl, not me. I'm not commenting on our own debate. When children only need about half marks to pass at grade 4, I question the reliability and validity of the system when it's about a number of marks rather than what's being tested. Same at Key Stage 2. And it is true. It is true in certain subjects more than others. The validity and reliability of the system is always a matter of debate, because the reality is, and people at Ofqual will tell you this, people who are senior examiners will tell you this, the reality is that in actual fact, if we're talking about performance, that's different from ability, in that on any given day, the same person might do differently depending on a number of variable factors. And the degree of variability would range from at least 2 to possibly 3 grades typically. So the same person on a different day could get a different grade within 1 or 2 grades. And it's very difficult to factor that out, because even if you used AI, you would still get that problem, albeit it would probably be a different type of problem. But it's a very, very difficult thing. But that's a whole extra area, how you assess what young people can do, and do so in a way that's valid and reliable and people can trust. But I think those 4 areas are for me, broadly speaking, they sound like sensible. I'm not, for what it's worth, I'm not in the scrap camp. I'm in the reform camp.
Yeah.
I think there were actually quite a lot of good things that happened in the reforms about 10 years ago, but I think there were also some things where it was taken too far, and clear experience now is that those things need to be reined back in again to get a better system. Tarjinder, you got any final views on this topic?
No, just that I think that there is some truth to that. Like, I know someone who's a drama teacher, and he was very much of the finding that actually what's happened to assessment in drama is it's been caught up with everything else, like say something like history, where possibly you did need more rigor and you did need more content, not necessarily as much as there was, like that's a separate question, but just that it ended up being a written exam, but it's drama, right? So how much writing is actually going to make you a better drama student, and actually we do need to think, so if you genuinely believe, or I think if anybody genuinely believes in the knowledge curriculum, then actually it's also got to be thought about, how is that knowledge best taught and how is it best assessed? Do you see what I mean? Actually, how do you do it within that subject? Because unless you think that, then actually what we're doing is saying it's generic, it doesn't matter, well, then you may as well be skills-based again, right? Because it doesn't make any difference. You're just saying it's all the same, and it's not all the same. Knowledge is different in different subjects. It's taught differently. It's broken up differently. It should be assessed differently in certain situations, but not everything. So then why don't we group certain things better than others? Because if that's not the best way to assess drama, then it's not the best way to assess drama. And I'm willing to take that on board.
No, I think that there's lots of good points there. Carl, again, different Carl, not me, said, me again, sorry, speaking from a primary perspective, children are taught a lot of stuff, but no time to get really good or deeply competent at anything. I think the problem there that Carl was referring to is applied to GCSE. In I certainly know in my subject history, there is this strong sense that there's way too much content, to the point where you're almost having to lecture lesson after lesson, because you've got no way of getting through the content unless you go at a sort of breakneck speed. And while obviously content does matter and knowledge is extremely important, you've got to get the balance right between breadth and depth, and that's always a dilemma, and maybe in some places that balance hasn't quite been achieved. I think it was Winston Churchill, I often remember a quote he gave, which was that democracy is something like this: democracy is a poor system of government, but it's better than all the others. And I think the issue with examinations are, in many ways, they're a poor system of assessment, but it's difficult to know how else any of the others would be any better. So you end up by default being in that position almost, to a degree. Anyway, we've aired that one, and thank you for the listeners' involvement. Yasmin, I'll pass back to you.
Okay, so our next topic is about the largest secondary school in York that has installed shutters in their 5 main toilet areas. So to give a bit of context about the school, I believe they've got about 1,900 pupils. And what they've done is they've installed these shutters on the outsides of the 5 main toilet areas so that they can be locked during lesson time. And the result of that is that some parents have complained. They've said that it's made the school look like a prison, that the school has taken away the children's human rights, and that every child has the right to use the toilet. the head teacher has then come back and basically reassured everybody that the children's rights aren't being taken away and they still can access toilets, but for safeguarding reasons, they've locked them during lesson times so that children are only able to use the toilets, I believe, during like recreational time. So what are you guys' thoughts?
Can I just make a point, Yasmin, if I may, which is, as is typical in lazy journalism, at the end of the article, the point's made by the head teacher that actually, if a child wants to go to the toilet during a lesson and the teacher gives them permission to do so, they actually can go to a toilet, and there are toilets open available for that purpose. And of course, they don't lead on that because that's not going to inflame views or polarize the debate, and therefore it's not going to get as many clicks, is it? And that's unfortunate because this is a dilemma that every secondary head in the country faces at the moment. And I say at the moment, over the last few years, it's got much more acute. And in actual fact, there isn't really the issue. If schools were allowed, as with most things, if schools were allowed to get on with it and actually to manage this situation properly, and journalists and media reporters stopped stirring the pot by misrepresenting things or creating faux outrage, whilst also, inflaming the social media warriors who, seem to spend most of their time angry about something, then actually the problem would largely go away, because most of the time the issue is that there are an awful lot of toilets in secondary schools that are vandalized on a daily basis, and I'm not exaggerating, on a daily basis. So when I say vandalized, I mean that whole toilet bowls will be ripped out, sinks will be ripped out, tiles and other elements of decoration will be torn off the walls. All those things are routine in secondary schools in this country. I'm going to call it out. I know they're routine. Similarly, graffiti of the most offensive and extreme nature, sometimes written in by ink, well, not ink, but in things, in byproducts that I hesitate to even dare describe, are routinely put on the walls of toilets in schools in our country. Now, this is not an acceptable state of affairs. It makes toilets no-go zones for a lot of young people, and it makes for toilets to become, hotbeds for racism, discrimination, and bullying, and all sorts of additional damages to school property, which are not in anybody's best interest, apart from being a vent of anger for certain young people who see it as some kind of an occupational pursuit. And most schools have a system where they will issue passes. Most secondary schools do. They'll issue a pass. I don't know in your school, Yasmin, if that's the case.
So as in a pass for children who might require the toilet, on medical. I've been to different schools, and every school I've been to has issued a pass for children who require one.
Yeah, so most schools do that. Most schools will tell teachers, secondary schools again, Tarjinder, so you'll probably have a different perspective to come in a second. And they will issue a pass or a card of some sort. A lot of schools track when a child has gone to the toilet, just to check that, they're not gone too long, and they have some means of seeing if they're going too frequently, or, because we know the reality is an awful lot of young people in secondary school asked to go to the toilet as a means of getting out the lesson, possibly meeting up with friends, possibly doing things that they shouldn't do. Vaping is the other one I haven't mentioned so far. That's been very, very common. And schools rightly want to make toilets safe places for young people to go. They don't want young people to be expressing themselves in terms of vandalism and deeply offensive graffiti. And surely no parent who was reasonable would think that. But these debates are inflamed by social media, amplified by the media, and then they're turned into something which actually, in the case of most schools, Oh, and also, sometimes TikTok does little crazies where they encourage young people to, either smash toilets or go on strike and things. That sort of thing happens. But if all that noise was taken out of it, and schools and teachers who experience this stuff every day were actually left to get on with it in the way they considered most appropriate, then largely it would be a non-issue. I don't know, Tarjinder, what your view is.
Yasmin, do you want to go ahead with that?
Yeah, go on. So this show, just a reminder that this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. You use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
Okay, for a start, the whole human rights thing really bothers me, right? Because for a start, we never actually ratified the children's human rights, like the UN Children's Charter. So actually, no, they don't have that. Like whatever it is that they're supposed to have under that charter, they don't have. And secondly, no, their ability to go to the toilet whenever they feel like it was not one of the things that was on that charter. So when it's like, come on, get a grip here. It's not a human right to go to the toilet whenever you feel like it as a primary or a secondary child in the school. That has never been a thing. It's not a thing, and I don't see why it keeps being raised, given that it's just not reality, right? So it annoys me. I think every school that I've worked in has always said if a child has a genuine medical diagnosis, they are allowed to go, and that's fine. That's not a problem. It's never been a problem. What is a problem is children, like you say, who make excuses, go out and do things. Now, look, at the end of the day, some children are going to be naughty and they're going to want to get out of things, they're going to want to do things, going to want to explore, they're going to want to rebel. It's always going to happen. But the point is, as an adult in that situation, whether it be the home or in school, you should have the ability to put in place what you need to, because how much is it genuinely costing in that situation to have, like you say, like the facilities actually destroyed all the time? And genuinely, I don't. I obviously I'm I'm older, so I don't remember it being a big thing that you had to go to the toilet during your break and your lunch. It was such a massive big. It wasn't a massive big deal actually. People slowly eroded this situation and gone from a genuine thing, which is possibly for certain children in very small situations. And actually, I don't have any kind of proven evidence on this, where a child was genuinely denied the ability to go to the toilet and wet themselves in a classroom, right? It must have happened somewhere. I'm not saying it did, never happened anywhere. My point is, where is the actual evidence this has been going on, right? So you never hear of the actual situation. It's just the possibility it may happen is enough to send people into a frenzy. And yet, the vast majority of children, for the vast majority of time that schools have existed and we've existed, have managed to go during break times and lunchtime. So they just have. That's what's been happening, right? Where obviously it's easier to manage, but also you can cope. You genuinely can. And on those few occasions where you can't, it's not a big deal. I don't remember having to go regularly out to the toilet from lessons all the time, because it was just you kind of basically just kind of trained yourself, right? You just kind of did. And it's fine, you'll cope. It's like being a teacher. Come on, you need a bladder of steel, quite frankly. We all know that. You can't just pop off whenever you feel like it, right? And I'm not saying that, you should. I'm not saying that anybody with a medical condition should make themselves. Nobody would be forced in that situation in normal situations. But this is not home. It's not like you can just go in and out whenever you fancy it. And even then, there's always going to be some sort of restriction. Nobody's got the same number of toilets that they've actually got people in the house, right? Occasionally you might have to wait to go to the bathroom. It's just not that big a deal. And I think we're making a massive thing out of something that's quite small. And like you say, we're allowing newspapers to make this into an even bigger issue all the time. And this poor head teacher has basically done the right thing, which is to say, right, I'm just going to stop. And I don't want to have to spend money on this anyway, over and over again, because if the facility is destroyed, well, then you're going to have to spend your money on those resources as opposed to something else. And I think it's fair enough. I had to go, no, fair enough. And if it's a shutter, it's a shutter. What difference does it make? What? Because if the door was different, it would have been a better situation. Well, if it's locked, it's locked. Job done. The fact that there's sort of, this whole thing about schools being like prisons. Schools are nothing like prisons. Get a grip. It's just not the same thing. I do wish that we did have some sort of moratorium in this situation, because it's so hard for schools to answer back or to speak back on this. And even when they do give the facts, that the original sources, the newspapers, don't care in the first place. Like there's never any kind of it's always on the school, isn't it? They've got to compromise. They've got to be seen as being something for this one person or these 2 or 3 people. But you're basically giving vocalization to the most unreasonable person in that community, and that's never going to bode well.
Yeah, and that's exactly because the articles aren't even about the safety of the kids, which ironically is what the school considers every day on every level. It's about, denigrating schools and, accusing them of, just being a bad place, which seems to really sell. And I really hate that. And I think schools are overwhelmingly reasonable places. And, even though I would say it's not, I completely agree with what Tarjinder is saying. Normally, the average child will kind of train themselves to know this is a time where I can't go to the toilet and this is a time where I can. And yes, here and there, you'll have, the odd kind of anomaly, maybe in summer when children have drank a lot more than had a lot more water than they might usually drink and things like that. But I like to think that if a school does lock their toilets during lesson time, that they still have some kind of protocol or on-call system where children can still maybe be collected to go to toilets, because they are ultimately children, and there are loads of things that aren't a medical condition that can still happen. Like the article mentioned, periods, like I said, sometimes children might drink a lot more than, or just have a reason where their bladder is full, maybe without a particular explanation, and they just really are desperate for the toilet in that moment in time. And from what I've seen, schools that do lock their toilets do still have a system where children can still often go to the toilet in exceptional circumstances. But, like you both, and children with medical conditions have always had a completely separate protocol where they often even have access to other toilets that maybe the majority of pupils don't have access to. I've seen schools that give toilet keys to particular children so they can carry that at all times. And, I think for me, this is way more about putting schools down than it is genuine concern for children. And I really hate that.
It absolutely is, and I couldn't agree more with both of you on this one. And therefore, it does irritate me when either the media or sometimes, I have to say, I've come across Ofsted inspectors who give credence to these totally, I think the phrase you used, Tarjinder, was the most unreasonable voices. Actually give credence to that and throw that back at schools as though schools have got to defend themselves, and that these are actually, perfectly reasonable things, which I think anybody working in education should surely know better. So, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I do think there's an element of canary in the coal mine about this, in that I think that all these things, and the parental anger, are actually more symptomatic of another problem, which isn't to do with toilets. Toilets are a proxy for these things, which is parents who are angry with the world, and often unreasonably so in the way they express it. The way they express it and the issues they express it on are often ill-chosen, and are often completely unreasonable, and the manner in which they do it is often threatening and unreasonable. But sitting beneath that is probably an underlying detachment that certain people in society have with public institutions, schools, police, hospitals. We all experience a certain level of abuse and extremely poor behavior from the users. And I think that taps into or begs a question about a much deeper sense of alienation, which has definitely become more noticeable in the last 10 years in this country. And it would be good if some of that were addressed in a different way. How you deal with that, and I don't think we as schools can wave a magic wand and cure that, but we're on the receiving end of it. And I think the very least the government could do is protect us more and give us a bit more authority to get on with doing our job.
I mean, I'd agree with you on that one, but I do think that part of the problem is that you've ended up in this, or we've ended up in a situation where, because we've allowed unreasonable people to guide the way to a certain extent, it just encourages more and more and more of it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, actually, and you're right, like we do need something where actually we're allowed to put our foot down. And I know that some people won't necessarily like this, but for example, when it came to de-escalation strategies and all the rest of it, there was a point at which remember, there were literally no touch policies. Literally, you were not allowed to like do anything. And it just made the situation so much worse with children. And some of them still think that actually, oh, if you touch me, it's like, no, if you're dangerous, we're allowed to do it. Like, I've actually had to say this to kids, like, actually, don't even go there. That's not true. But it took for the government to actually put that in place so that we could actually feel safe doing our jobs and keep other children safe as well. Because don't forget, there was a point at which there were people leaving just because they knew, particularly in secondary, because they knew they could not keep the children safe. So you either risked your job or you risked the child being hurt. Like, it was just not a good situation for us to be in. And I think this is another situation which we cannot keep affording to be in, because it does drive and make things worse for head teachers. And if we're going to say that we want decent leadership, we want to, recruit and retain good teachers, well, then we've got to be able to recruit and retain good leaders as well. And we can't make that happen if we haven't got their back and they're constantly having to worry about ending up in the local newspaper over something stupid like this, which is a perfectly reasonable decision for that head teacher to have made. Like you said, the reality of the situation is not that children are not allowed to go to the toilet at any time other than break time. The reality is, all they've said is that the main toilets, the main ones, which quite frankly, that many children shouldn't need during those times anyway. They should only need the limited number of ones that they've got already. And if there's genuinely something else, if they genuinely do have like more children with like medical issues, they themselves would have thought something through. They don't. So they should have been allowed to be protected from that. And actually, it should not be encouraged. These newspapers continue to write these stories, which are just non-stories. All they do is make life difficult for the staff and the students, or the majority of students in that school, because that solution would have been better for all of them anyway, and would have made it more pleasant for them to be able to use the toilets during the times when they are allowed. And it makes no difference. All it does is encourage people who are unreasonable to look at it and go, all right, do you know what? I can go to the newspaper, I can say this, and there's no consequence for them whatsoever. No. You know? There was like another story that I know that we've covered before, where there was a multi-academy trust that actually helped support the legal defence, and they didn't do it out of the main budget. I'm just going to point that out. It was done through additional funds. And then they were being criticised because this person was being harassed. But actually, I think that what they were trying to do was to make a point and to really sort of put their own foot down and say, well, no, we've got to support this. But that should not come down to the trust or the local authority or whoever, or even the unions up to a point. Actually, there comes a point where you have to say the government has got to have rules about how public sector workers are treated in certain situations, because actually what we're doing is we're just eroding trust in this situation, and we're making it harder and harder for those people to do the jobs that they're supposed to want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the real story here is not the question of shutters in toilets. The real story here is that a head teacher in a school are being harassed, and media coverage is deliberately inflaming that for its own benefit, when actually what that head teacher and that school are doing is not only entirely reasonable, but it's to protect young people and make sure that toilets in this particular case are safe and pleasant places to go to. And we've got to start supporting the people in our society who are doing things for the benefit of everybody, and stop giving more airtime to the sirens of chaos and anger, because all that does in the end, and that poor head teacher will probably be having sleepless nights because she'll be feeling like, when's the next issue now? People have already piled on with this issue. So they're probably now going to think, oh, right, we've been empowered, so we're going to pile in on the next issue and the next issue. And how long those people then end up saying, you know what, I'm going to get out of education because I'm sick of trying to do the right thing. And people who definitely aren't reasonable are being given the power to stop me doing it. And I think we do have a real problem there, and that can't continue.
And also, I don't doubt that this article will have done the rounds through the group chats and social media of the pupils actually on roll, which I believe is close to 2,000 kids. That's a huge school. And, you know, the impact that will also have on the wider behavior policies, the integrity of, you know, the school systems, because now you've got children who know that even the media are critical of what their head teacher has done.
Yeah.
Like, it's massively undermined the head teacher. And my favorite quote from the article is, quote, "I have 3 children going through the school and a 4th who would be going there, but at the moment we are not even thinking about it." Like, that for me sums it up. Like, it's got very little to do with toilets, and it's about, you know, publicly declaring that you don't like a school. And you know, I've reached that point where I always think, when will the media, the mainstream media, be held accountable for the impact they also have on declining behavior standards? Because they are. If I was a kid in this school and I saw this, I'd be, who wouldn't? Like, the typical child will think, oh, you know, our head teacher doesn't know what they're doing. And that's the fault of the mainstream media platforming and enabling this kind of aggression towards schools.
I think there's got to be something that comes into place where we have to say that parents, before they go to the media, I'm not saying they should never be allowed, right? Because I would never say you should never be allowed to do something in that situation, because what will happen is something really bad will happen naturally. They've got a valid reason for going, but there must be procedures first, right? There must be procedures, right? As in, have you gone through this and this channel? And if you have, then you're allowed to go to the media. Otherwise, no, it's illegal, and you'll be prosecuted if you do it.
I think every article should have, because every time I see something like this, I do always think, have you followed the school's formal procedures? Because every school's got, you know, complaints procedures, or the forum to even informally chat about your concerns. And I think every article should have to state whether or not the parents have actually followed, you know, the school's procedures. I feel like it should be at the bottom of the article, because it tells you a lot about. Though obviously then what would end up happening is, because people want to go to the media, they'll just flood the school with like loads of, they will probably just put in a complaint anyway.
For the response, right? They will at least have to wait for the response. And therefore, the media cannot report that story, because otherwise there will be consequences for the media and for the parents. And actually, I think that's fair enough. I think it is. I think it's time that we put our foot down on this one and actually said, like, the government needs to put something in place, because clearly it's not working. There's kind of like this social system whereby we try and say, well, if we're just decent about it, well, I'm sorry, there's too many people who are not decent about it, who've been encouraged, who now know that they can go through a certain procedure, and guess what? That nothing bad will ever happen. They can grade their children on, you know, in the media and in schools, and in newspapers and online, and not think anything of it. Literally not think anything of it, right? Like, you know, the same children we might not even be able to take a picture of in school are then paraded through like media outlets, and that's fine. Well, actually, you do have a responsibility as a citizen. And I don't think the vast majority of us who are paying our taxes so that your child can go to school are doing it so your child will sit there, be badly behaved, and no one can teach and no one can get on with things, right? That's not what people are doing. This is about public money as well. Like, we're literally spending public money on this, right? So why are we spending it on what a worse behavior, like a worse behaved school, worse behaved children? Like, that's not what people want. That's not what they're paying for.
No, I couldn't agree more. And it's the silent majority of those parents probably in that school, and the silent majority of pupils in that school who are actually absolutely fine with what's happened and see no issue really at all. But of course, they've been encouraged and cajoled, and they might even feel obliged to say something because everybody else is saying something. And that doesn't serve, you know, it doesn't serve anybody's interests in the long run. It just creates more fraction. And you're absolutely right, Tarjinder. Power without accountability is not a good thing. You know, yes, you have the right to free speech, but you also should be accountable for what you say. And yet it seems like schools and public servants generally are very, very accountable for everything they do. And the people that are unreasonable in so many cases, who are sniping from the sidelines, have no accountability whatsoever. And that's a completely, unhealthy situation.
Should we sum up there, guys?
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I think, this has been a good chat. I've enjoyed it. And thank you to everybody that's tuned in today, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused